Chapter 16. Chapter 16 Strengthening Ties.
They what?
Sindel shrieked at Dran, her hands balling into fists at her sides. The normal, soothing answer she normally would have received from the High Priest at any other time did not suit Dran's fury. Dran had witnessed the Frost Giant's actions from the Illithid's crystal scrying ball alone, for Sindel didn't want to return to the chamber of telepathic beasts. He had seen and heard it all. Sindel's ex-party was on its way to the spires of Darkmoon, courtesy of the captain of the Frost Giants. That's what I get for trusting a tribe of refugee giants, Dran thought cynically to himself while pondering at Sindel's intently agonized facial expression. But he had been so sure of the giant's protection. He thought for a moment about the prophecy he had read to Sindel, and how it mentioned friends to foes. The High Priest sighed and hoped to God he was misinterpreting the old script. He knew he shouldn't let the old unmarked book haunt his thoughts as it had for the past week, since Sindel's cursed team had decided to ravage his beloved temple. Dran's voice was grating.
They let them pass, Sindel.
He repeated, finding his own words hard to believe. Sindel spun away and covered her face with her hands. Dran shook his head, then, with a surge of anger, hit the small table that stood beside the altar in his personal chambers. The room went silent for a few moments as the two clerics were left to their thoughts. I should have known, Dran thought as he stared aimlessly ahead, but that's all right. I'm prepared for those meddling fools. They won't find their stay at Darkmoon pleasant anymore, I swear it. They're so close now. He would have kept rambling silently if Sindel wouldn't have spoken up, her voice calm now.
What type of impediment have you up here?
She asked and caught Dran's eye as he looked over at her.
My best.
The High Priest replied, leaning his hands on his red and gold altar. He registered Sindel's blank expression and elaborated for her.
Mages, my dear, mages. Lots and lots of them. Members of the temple too. I keep the more experienced priests and priestesses up here so that they won't cause trouble with the younger ones who reside near the lobby. Generation conflicts are the worst.
He said simply and found himself smiling all of a sudden. Sindel reflected his smile with one of her own.
Sounds good.
She opted.
Now let's hope they keep their end of the bargain. I wouldn't want another Frost Giant episode to be pulled.
She turned to look up at Dran. The high-ranking cleric's smile dimmed and a frown of concern replaced it.
That would make me very angry. It could also cost us our lives.
Dran gulped. He examined Sindel and a thought came to his mind that had never occurred to him before.
Are you sure you want to stay at my side in this, Sindel?
He asked, beginning to realize the finality of the danger that was building.
It could become very costly. And I'm not talking of finance.
He said, his voice going serious and businesslike. Sindel wrapped her arms around herself protectively and held Dran's gaze. She knew what she had gotten into when she accepted the High Priest's offer to become his High Priestess, and now that she thought about it, she admitted to herself that she had no honest regrets about her decision. She felt so much happier and valuable in the spires of Darkmoon than she had ever felt amongst her ex-party. She was accepted and understood at Dran's side, a rare feat that she had found no one to execute until then. It wasn't often in her life that she had actually been content. Her prominent position within Darkmoon made her happy. It was what she had always wanted. And now she had it. And she had Dran to thank for it.
I'm staying right where I am now,
Sindel declared gravely, her blue eyes shimmering with unshakable decisiveness. Gratefully, Dran planted a kiss on Sindel's forehead and hugged her to him. Will concentrated with such effort on Kelvin's image that his brow was soaked with sweat.
But Kelvin, we're so close to reaching our goal.
He cried mentally, the image of the Archmage dimmed and flickering with an unknown interference.
I tell you William, be very careful in your next moves. Everything you and the others do now is crucial. This is the part of the mission that proves whether you will succeed. Or whether I will be forced to hire another team.
Kelvin Blackstaff warned with a haughty tone in his voice that tweaked Will's patience. The image wavered and Will cursed the disturbance, finding it extremely difficult to work with.
Yes, yes. Kelvin? Are you getting as much trouble with the contact as I am?
He asked curiously. The Archmage frowned and shook his head.
No. What's the matter?
He asked, a drastic change of subject from their previous, heated conversation. Will struggled with the telepathic link even more now. Kelvin was a blur.
I don't really know, something's killing the link. I can hardly see you.
He stuttered. Kelvin said something in return but Will did not hear it for the contact between the two ceased abruptly.
Damn.
Will spat, throwing the golden coin he held to the ground. The other members of the crew gathered around, confused expressions on their faces.
What is it?
Massage asked and helped Will up from his sitting position. The cleric brushed off his crimson robes and glared at the whole team.
I can't keep a clear connection with Kelvin,
he said sharply, his annoyance now quite clear. Will's patience had greatly diminished since the team's arrival at Darkmoon, but the priest hardly noticed. Coming up to face him was Meeks, her usual look of confusion pasted on her small features.
Does that mean we're alone now?
She asked, not sure if it really mattered seeing as Kelvin was never that much of a help. He was actually the cause to some of their confusion concerning their mission. Will took a deep breath and bent down to retrieve his backpack.
Yes, Meeks. I believe it does.
He said simply. A mutual groan passed through the team and Meeks spoke up as they all turned towards the teleporter in hopes of leaving the Frost Giant audience hall.
Wait. I'm hungry, what about having some lunch before we walk into our deaths?
She piped brightly and held her arms out for the others to gather around her. Prisma coughed and narrowed her eyes at the little warrior.
Didn't Nightshade and I give you a sustenance ring?
She asked venomously. Meeks shrugged and then looked at her hand where the little golden ring shone brightly on her middle finger.
Maybe I broke it.
She tried, somewhat disappointed that the magical ring hadn't taken full effect on her and desperate to explain her misfortune. Massage covered his mouth and hid his smile. Prisma slapped her hand to her head and rolled her eyes.
Gimme the ring, Meeks.
She said quickly, gesturing with her open hand. Meeks, looking like a lost child, handed the ring over to the dark elven sorceress and interlocked her fingers innocently.
Can we still eat?
She asked anew. There were no windows in the Frost Giant audience hall, but Sanral guessed it to be a little past midday. Will, despondent, created a great big meal for all, figuring it just might be their last. He didn't count on eating that night. He guessed the team would be quite busy running and hiding and fighting for their lives. He wondered if it was all worth it for a split second, then named himself the team's moral advisor and kept his chin up. If he didn't keep his team from going corrupt like Sindel had, then no one would. It would be chaos.
Anyone thought of Izzy lately?
Will asked as the crew ate greedily around him. Everyone looked up except Prisma and Nightshade, who kept eating.
Not really.
Alexia admitted sheepishly and blushed despite herself. At her side, Sanral pushed his stark white hair back.
I don't mean to sound cruel, Will, but please. I beg of you. Quit mentioning our losses, alright? It doesn't help the confidence factor.
He said and downed a fifth cup of water. Undaunted, Meeks licked the bottom of her bowl of soup like an animal.
Where do you suppose she is now?
She asked. Massage watched her rude table manners and, gawking, slowly pulled the bowl away from her. She didn't seem to notice. Instead, she reached for another bowl nearby. Will tried not to look directly at the fighter.
I don't know, Meeks. Maybe Dran has her.
He said thoughtlessly. Sanral shook his head, suddenly serious.
You have no idea how much I want to ruin that one.
He said darkly, speaking of Darkmoon's high priest. The live drow blamed Dran for his years as a slave within the temple, even though he had never seen the man in his entire life. He hated Darkmoon for having cost him the loss of his dignity. Alexia looked over at him and frowned.
Is it the slave thing again, Sanral?
She asked, and Sanral couldn't tell if it was a comment or a question. He challenged her gaze and smirked.
Yes, it is.
He looked down at the floor when Alexia's expression softened, proving her last comment to be a question, not an offense.
It was so shameful.
He breathed. The group had veered their attention on the interesting scene folding out before them. Alexia rested a strong hand on the mage's thigh.
We're all very sorry about your pain, Sanral, especially me. But, don't you think you deserved imprisonment after causing the revolt?
She said tentatively. Sanral looked over at Alexia with the corner of his eye. His muscles tightened.
It's not the imprisonment we're discussing, Alexia, it's the years I've passed as a servant.
His voice cracked on the last word, and Alexia knew that the wizard's temper had nudged its way into the danger zone.
I'm looking over here now.
Meeks said in a tiny voice and turned around to face the wall. She really didn't care to see her friends fight, not after all the fighting that had happened before, and all the trouble it had caused. Alexia ignored Meek's comment and returned her attention on the fuming mage.
Look, maybe the clerics thought it to be fit punishment for the deeds you committed.
She proposed optimistically. She knew the issue they were now discussing would have come up at one time or another the closer they got to Dran Dragor. It was inevitable. Sanral's crimson eyes opened wide and he threw his arms out dramatically.
I would rather have died, Alexia. He cried. Do you have any idea how long spiritual wounds remain? Much longer than bodily ones, I assure you.
He went on, raving like a complete maniac during a lapse. Alexia's crystal blue eyes radiated kindness towards the panic-stricken drow.
I know, Sanral.
She soothed and reached out to touch the wizard's hand, but he drew back instantly.
You cannot undo what is done. You're going to have to learn to live with it. That's what friends are for. That's what I'm for.
She said, and Sanral's hand did not draw back when she reached out to touch it a second time. The group was utterly silent now, as Sanral and Alexia stared at each other in silent contemplation. Sanral cocked his head and gave Alexia a half-smile.
Are you in love with me?
He asked slyly. There were no gasps amongst the team. Massage smiled knowingly at his fellow mage. Elixia grinned suddenly and her hand tightened around Sanral's.
No use stating the obvious, Drow. And you? Are you in love with me?
She asked softly. Sanral's half-smile became a grin and Elixia pulled the mage to her and kissed him kindly on the lips. Nightshade and Prisma blushed and began to clap with delight.
Is it over?
Meeks asked, still facing the wall with her hands covering her ears. When she got no answer, she turned around and beheld her team in a state of happiness. Nightshade and Prisma clapped cheerfully at Sanral and Elixia, who were entangled in each other's arms. Will smiled wide and held his hands together thankfully, and Massage threw his arm around Meek's shoulders playfully.
So it's over,
she declared to herself and leaned her head on Massage's shoulder, figuring it was the proper thing to do at that time. In the illithid chamber of the spires of Darkmoon, Rain and his fellow mind flayers congratulated themselves for their last move. The 7-man party was now completely cut off from the outside world. Telepathic conversations were impossible now that the illithids had erected a silence wall around the temple's entire structure. Dran would be pleased. Rain knew Kelvin could no longer interfere in his affairs. The wall had taken quite some time to build and had cost the illithids a hefty sum of power. Fortunately for them, they had a lot more.
Ugh!
Came a high, feminine voice from the doorway of Rain's chambers. The illithid leader looked over to behold a short, orange-haired woman who was being held by 2 mind flayers. Rain shook his gelatinous-looking head.
Welcome, Elizabeth,
he said telepathically to the disgusted young lady. Izzy couldn't believe what she was seeing. The creatures were so repulsive. She had been taken away by the Mantis warriors down in the test of faith and had been drugged. She had regained consciousness that morning to find herself in a richly decorated and carpeted room. She had immediately been taken away again by 2 creatures who spoke to her through her thoughts. They brought her to a set of intermingled chambers where more of the ugly creatures worked. They kept telling her she had to speak to Rain.
What do you want from me?
She asked desperately, unable to believe her rotten luck. In the corner of her eye she saw a large crystal sphere, and in it, she caught a fleeting glimpse of 7 people whom she recognized from not too long ago. Before her, Rain approached, his long robes rustling on the blood-colored carpet.
You are going to be very useful to us, Elizabeth,
he said in her mind, and the 2 illithids who held her let go and drifted away silently.
Fine,
Meeks complained as Prisma gave the ring of sustenance to Will.
Give it to him then.
She pouted and Elixia hit her on the back of the head as she walked past her. Everyone was ready and waiting in front of the hovering, pink crystal and teleportation crystals. This was it, this was the point they had to cross to go from doable danger to too much danger. Will wrung his hands and turned back to the others.
Are we ready?
He asked symbolically. He got in return 6 pairs of determined eyes. All right then, he mumbled to himself and exhaled sharply.
Let's go.
He disappeared first, followed by Meeks and Elixia, Massage and Sanral, and Prisma and Nightshade last. End of chapter. Chapter 17. Chapter 17 The Spires of Temple Darkmoon.
It's beautiful,
Nightshade gasped, looking at the rich walls and decorations around her. The teleporter that had brought the team there had disappeared, being only a temporary mode of transportation. They now stood facing an open room, a staircase going up directly ahead of them across the room. It was quiet, very, very quiet.
Let me see.
Meeks called from the back. She had made a desperate attempt to restrain the teleportation crystals when they had begun to disappear and had failed miserably. The brash fighter pushed her way to the head of the team and her jaw dropped instantly on sight of the area.
Oh geez, this guy is loaded,
she gasped. On her right side, Will grunted.
The money probably came from all the innocent people he's scammed,
he commented sourly, giving the crew the idea that he would not be his same old optimistic self now that they were so close to Dran Dragor. The walls were intricately carved with sweeping images made of golden-hued metal. The floor was carpeted with thick, red, gold, and black carpet. Hanging from the wall were banners, their colors matching those of the carpet, with the same dragon symbol emblazoned on them that the party members had in their palms. Niches in the wall held statuettes, orbs, and other objects that shimmered with jewels or bristled with finely cut edges. The treasure-bearing niches were usually centered on large walls or directly below windows. There were 2 windows in the chamber they all stood in now, one on each side of the room. Prisma fidgeted suddenly.
Wait. I think I heard something,
she warned, her eyes scanning the room suspiciously for any invisible creatures that might be holding sentry. Massage came up beside her and shook his head calmly.
It's probably a bird or something from outside,
he reasoned, looking over at the window nearest him. Prisma and the rest of the crew followed his gaze and Elixia spoke up soon after.
The afternoon is coming to its end, guys. We've had a pretty heavy day,
she said dully, looking out at the water-deep forest in a longing manner, she began to daydream about being back in Mythdraenor with her family and friends.
And it's not done yet, Elixia.
Sanral cooed, placing a hand on the redhead's waist and looking over at the staircase that stood so mysteriously off to the side. Elixia sighed and left the windowsill with difficulty.
Come now friends, let's go and complete our quest. I'm growing tired of this charade, as I am sure you all are, and I'll be too happy to finally put an end to this mess.
She declared grandly, then drew her scimitar and stalked towards the staircase.
Amen to that.
Will called after her and hurried his pace to join the determined woman. The whole team, in a surge of energy and pep, mounted the staircase and willingly gave themselves up to whatever waited beyond. To greet the 7 teammates at the top of the stairs were 2 robed figures.
Halt! You've no authorization.
One of them called harshly, untucking his hands from the thick sleeves of his robes. Without much warning, blue lightning fizzled and snaked through the man's fingers, then, within seconds, he raised his hands and shot his magic forth. The team didn't really have the chance to react because they had been caught off guard when reaching the top of stairs. The wizard's lightning hit the team full force, burning and slicing at flesh and cloth. Meeks, who had jumped to the side a little after the searing blue flame had begun to assault the party, held out her marked hand to the 2 mages.
But we have the mark!
She screamed, shoving the dragon symbol towards the front. Unaffected, the mage who had cast the lighting spell removed his hood calmly while the one who accompanied him raised his hands to strike at the party. But this time, the little group was not inanimate. Meeks and Elixia jumped the mage who had removed his hood, and the man screamed a muffled cry of pain as polearm and scimitar bit into his velvet robes and flesh.
Kathak si!
Prisma hollered and snapped her hand forward in a shielding manner.
Ake Rhea!
She then spat and a black ribbon shot from her palm and encircled the second wizard. The group watched, except Elixia and Meeks, who were busily wiping the blood off their weapons on the dead wizard's robes, as Prisma yanked her hand back, cutting off the dark ribbon, and then raised it high in the air and flicked her wrist. The wizard entangled in the ribbon collapsed to the floor, dead.
I love that spell!
Prisma cheered, rubbing her hands together. Nightshade patted her back and grinned proudly at her friend.
What is it called? I don't think I've ever seen it before.
The thief asked inquisitively. Prisma held up her finger triumphantly.
Ashkara's death ribbon spell,
she said pointedly and winked at Sanral, who she could see staring out of the corner of her eye.
That was a very rude greeting,
Will declared, completely stupefied by the 2 mages' offensive behavior.
They didn't even care about the mark of Darkmoon, they just attacked us like maniacs.
He rambled on to no one in particular. Massage walked past the cleric and bent to look at the dead mages' bodies.
You wouldn't care for small talk either if your temple was being ransacked. And besides, how hard is it to recognize a team of 7 armed people? I'm sure our descriptions are known all over the temple thanks to High Priestess Sindalflame,
he said vindicatively and removed a small ring from the hand of the mage that Prisma had magically attacked. He held it up to the torchlight. It was made of a red stone that was, oddly, cool to the touch.
It's a fire resistance ring,
he said brightly and twitched his nose.
Good thing we didn't cast a fireball spell at this guy. You were pretty damn lucky to have picked the death ribbon spell, Prisma.
Massage congratulated the other drow and got to his feet with effort. He looked at the little ring a while, lost in thought, then he slipped it onto the ring finger of his right hand.
You're gonna keep it?
Meeks asked him, coming over to fiddle with Massage's finger. The mage looked down at her and shook his head.
You really have to get over the fact that you don't have a sustenance ring anymore, love. You won't be getting any more rings until we're all out of this temple, understand?
He said kindly and gazed into the deep, ever-curious pools that were Meek's black eyes.
But that doesn't mean that I can't have a ring,
he finished. Meeks pouted and Massage sighed.
Anything on the other mage?
Sanral asked, eyeing Massage's new ring. Massage searched the other body but found nothing. He then shook his head apologetically at his fellow mage. Sanral rolled his eyes. Fine. He choked and clutched his spell book tighter. When the group had settled and were once again ready to go, a good look at the area was greatly needed. They were in a long corridor lined with about 10 closed doors. All was silent. The party members looked at each other and frowned. The silence was unusual for such a big temple. Will figured the doors might block off storage rooms of some sort but then discarded the idea. Why would Darkmoon need so much storage space? It made no sense. Perhaps they were chambers, but why such silence? Even prayer wasn't that quiet. Nightshade, wary of this kind of stuff, tightened her grip on her short sword.
I don't like the looks of this. I think it may be a setup,
she warned, keeping her voice low although the team had already been loud enough with the destruction of the 2 mages that the whole temple could have heard them coming. Unfortunately, Meeks, as usual, had already begun to venture out ahead. See? She called back to the team, rather loudly.
There's nothing wrong with.
She stopped short when all 10 doors opened and angry clerics tore out of each.
I could be wrong.
Meeks yelped as the clerics surrounded the party. Izzy sat, unmoving, in a cold metal chair. Rain and the Illithids stood around her, silent as they always were. She wondered what they had in store for her, and not to mention when she would see her friends again. A profound sorrow swept over her and she felt lonely. The quiet Illithids did not the feeling. She wondered if her team missed her, well, most of her team at least, and wished she was back with them. Even if it meant putting up with Prisma and Nightshade's constant teasing.
Elizabeth.
Rain's watery voice entered the little thief's mind and she hurriedly picked out the voice's owner who stood off to her side.
What?
She snapped annoyedly, wishing they would just leave her be. Rain did not relent.
Quiet. I will do the talking and you will do the listening from now on.
He hissed at her angrily. Izzy wished she could move. She was under the effect of the Illithid's paralysis spell and she hated it. Within seconds, a psychic blast hit Izzy's mind and it felt like claws sinking into her brain. She screamed for a moment and then heard Rain's voice again, strong and imperative.
Contact the members of your raiding party, all of them.
He ordered. Izzy found she could not resist the command.
Yes, Master Rain.
She breathed monotonously and closed her eyes. She focused her attention on her old friends. The clerics that exited the chambers were about 20 in number and, as the team soon figured unfavorably, high-ranking. The warriors succeeded in striking down about 4 of them, but the priest and priestess's hold spells were quicker and more effective. The 7 friends were taken hastily to a room where they were all shackled to the wall and stripped of their backpacks, weapons, and baubles. Frozen in the magical sense, none of them noticed their plight until the cleric's spells wore off.
Shit!
Meeks and Elixia cried at the same time when they examined the room and their obvious losses. Around them, Massage and Wool recovered from their numbness. Nightshade, Prisma, and Sanral were still under the effect of the spells.
Oh dear lord!
Wool whined in a half-whisper once he realized his predicament. Massage almost began to cry.
My spellbook? It's gone.
He sniffed boyishly. A loud ringing sound came about and Wool looked over to see Meeks banging her shackles on the wall behind her.
Jesus Christ! Frigging piece of crap! We're so screwed!
She raved, her teeth tight together and her face bright red. Elixia kicked Meeks' leg to stop her from yelling. Shh!
I hear voices outside.
She whispered and Meeks clicked out of her fit for a moment to listen.
Act like you're still paralyzed.
She urged her conscious teammates and stared straight ahead, forcing herself not to blink.
Can you believe how dumb these guys were to walk the living quarters?
A husky female voice said, approaching the doorway to where the team was held captive. A male chuckle sounded, followed by a comment.
I really don't care. Important thing is that Dran's going to be very happy to see these fools.
He said as the two appeared in the doorway. They were clerics of Darkmoon, and the team recognized their voice. They were the 2 clerics that the team had first run into when entering Darkmoon, Nadia and Joril. The crew had not destroyed them, they had simply locked them out for the time being.
There's one more drow than there was when we first saw them, hun.
Joril stated more than asked, examining the team carefully. Nadia tossed back her blonde hair and sneered at the shackled warriors.
Brigands, mercenary scum. How dare they attack us? And on Kelvin's orders.
She fumed. Joril looked away from the prisoners and took Nadia's shoulders.
Settle down, I'm sure everything will be worked out. Now let's go get Dran.
He said and the 2 turned and left.
I knew you would get M.
Sindel cheered gleefully, jumping about at Dran's side. The 2 waited patiently at the bottom of the stairs leading to Dran's chambers. They awaited the word from the cell guards to go pay a visit to Sindel's ex-party. Dran Dragor smiled widely, his heart beating at about 1,000 miles an hour.
It seems the wait will not be as long as I expected.
He said brightly.
Perhaps today will be the day I rid myself of my misfortune.
He added, hoping sincerely that that day had finally come. From around the corner appeared 2 clerics in blue and red robes. They looked grave.
What is it?
Dran asked them when they had come near. Sindel leaned heavily on his arm, her feet constantly moving below her. The female cleric shook her head.
They make me so angry.
She began, looking up at Dran hopefully, her eyes filled with pained frustration. The male cleric patted her shoulder.
Pardon Nadia, my lord, she is rather affected by Darkmoon's situation at the moment.
He cast a sorry look at Nadia, who scowled deeply, and returned his gaze to Dran.
You may follow us to where the raiding party is being held captive.
Dran nodded and followed the 2 clerics, Sindel pulling him along behind her.
We have to get out of here.
Elixia declared seconds after Nadia and Joril had left. She was filled with sudden panic at the thought of Dran coming to see them all. She didn't want to die. She looked over to her left and Meeks nodded her approval. Will and Massage didn't look so revved up.
And just how do you propose we do that, Elixia?
Massage asked cynically. Elixia frowned. Massage was right. At the other end of the room, the rest of the crew woke up from their magical slumber.
Oh crap!
Cried Sanral, realizing he had been robbed of his magical things. At his side, Prisma rolled her eyes at the sight of the crew's predicament.
Great!
She spat. Nightshade frowned and tried not to think about the horrible situation they were all in.
What happened?
She asked basically.
Paralysis spells.
Meeks said, mispronouncing the word. Nightshade pursed her lips. Ah! She said after a bit. Elixia's voice was shrill when she spoke.
Dran's coming. We have to get out of here. Now!
She cried, thrashing about in her shackles. Nightshade licked her parched lips and looked up at the metal braces on her wrists.
I can get us out of here,
she said decisively. Instantly, everyone in the team looked over at her and smiled, their eyes aglow.
I need something about the size of a pin,
she said methodically, eyeing the crew for such an item. Beside her, Prisma fumbled with her ear with a shaky hand.
I got it, babe. My earring, it's real skinny,
she said and finally pulled the thing off her ear, then handed it to Nightshade carefully so that she wouldn't drop it. Nightshade pinched the small piece of metal between her thumb and forefinger and inserted the thing into the left shackle's lock.
Now the trick is to find,
she paused and tinkered minutely as the whole team watched impatiently,
the little...
She paused again and squinted.
Thing,
she said finally and the lock clicked open. The entire team sighed a homogeneous sigh of relief. Sindal's expression was of pure glee.
Are you going to kill them?
She asked devilishly as she, Dran, and the two other clerics descended yet another flight of stairs. Dran's eyes went absent for a moment.
What kind of a question is that?
He said calmly and looked over at Sindal who grinned up at him.
What would you do?
He asked her. She laughed throatily and yelped a cry of excitement. The little group of deceptively powerful clerics stalked through the spires of the temple at a fast pace, the spirit of freedom growing strong in their hearts. At last, Darkmoon would rid itself of a costly direct attack force. What a day this would be. They walked through the hallway of high-ranking clerics' rooms and arrived at an intersection where a left turn was possible. They went left and walked by a room bristling with weaponry and other things, and then Nadia and Jorel lead them to the room where Sindal's ex-team was being held. When the inside of the room was in view, Nadia and Jorel stopped short.
What they?
Jorel mumbled and jogged up to the cell. Behind him, Dran and Sindal became worried.
What? What's wrong?
Sindal called, running behind Jorel and Nadia towards the firelit room. Dran's eyes flared when he walked over to the room and peered inside of it.
They're gone,
he screamed at Nadia and Jorel as he towered over them. The two clerics whimpered and got down on their knees.
They were there when we left to get you,
Nadia cried, holding her hands together pleadingly up at the angered high priest above her. Jorel swallowed audibly.
She's not lying, my lord. They were there,
he added, pointing to the shackles. Dran looked over at Sindal. Sindal shrugged her shoulders lightly and then looked down at the groveling Nadia and Jorel.
How could they have gotten away?
She asked them, her voice somewhat less edgy than Dran's had been. Nadia shook her head violently.
I really don't know, mistress,
she whimpered, her rosy cheeks tear-stained now. Sindal turned to look at Dran. The high priest looked back at where they had come from.
They're beginning to upset me, Sindal,
Dran began, forcing his voice to soothe.
Your team is really beginning to upset me, Sindal.
He swept around, leaving the three other clerics behind, and left the room hastily. Sindal looked down at Nadia and Jorel, and then turned and sped after Dran.
Wait!
She called after him but he kept walking anyway. End of chapter. Chapter 18. Chapter 18 A Mind Game.
Holy Mother of God!
Meeks gasped quietly and slapped her hand over her mouth as Dran, Sindal, and two other clerics stalked by the small room that she and her team were hidden in. After Nightshade had so craftily unlocked everybody from their shackles, the crew had darted out of the room and had taken refuge in a small chamber just around the corner. Luck abiding, it happened to be the chamber where all their belongings had been taken. When the small band of clerics had passed, the team could breathe again.
Why didn't we just run instead of hiding in here like sitting ducks?
Prisma asked, keeping her voice down so that the clerics next door wouldn't hear any commotion coming from outside. Elixia looked around the room and began gathering her belongings.
Sure Prisma, and run right into Dran and the others,
she said sarcastically, picking up her scimitar and clutching it tightly. Prisma pursed her lips and nodded.
You have a point there,
she decided and got to her own retrieval of goods. As quietly as possible, the entire gang scooped up their things and got ready to go.
Where's my packsack?
Nightshade asked with a pout. She scanned the room once more and the others mimicked her. The bag was gone.
Those jerks probably took it cause it was full of goodies,
she said with a deep frown. Nightshade's definition of goodies was, good lockpicks, stone-to-flesh dust bags, knickknacks she had stolen along the way, and other items that might have come in handy during her adventure. Unfortunately for her, now was not the time to mourn, the team had to get moving as quickly as possible. The cleric's voices in the other room began to grow loud and angry. It was time for the group of warriors to get going.
Let's go,
Will urged, creeping out of the small room and into the hallway. The team followed him around the corner just ahead and they found themselves back within the hallway of cleric bedchambers, where they had all been paralyzed and captured a few moments earlier. Wordlessly, the crew hurried through the corridor, unassailed this time.
Why didn't those mean clerics attack us again?
Meeks asked, catching her breath and leaning up against a wall once the crew had reached the place where lay the bodies of the two dead mages. Massage shook his head and looked fearfully down at the bodies.
They probably thought we were Dran and the other priests. I honestly don't think they would have jumped their leader,
he said softly. His eyes searched the area nervously. Massage was not a fan of the feeling of being tracked down.
Maybe we should go the opposite way we came from on teleporting here,
Elixia suggested warily, tugging on Meek's wrist. Nightshade nodded quickly, her visage was somewhat pained.
Good idea. I really don't like being so close to where Dran and the others are. We better move fast. I don't know if they'll be coming back this way,
she said and began marching down the staircase just ahead. The group followed in her footsteps and found themselves in the large room with two windows. Outside, dusk was settling. The little team tore down the hallway they had previously appeared in at top speed. They stopped short, falling over each other, when the hallway branched off to a room filled with shifting walls. The golden-hued walls moved back and forth, appearing and disappearing as they pleased. It was impossible to tell what was beyond them.
Somebody care to explain what's going on here?
Elixia asked back at her squad, holding her arms out at her sides in a protective manner to hold her team back. Behind her, 3 groans sounded, those of the team's mages.
Dran doesn't play nice,
Prisma commented, her voice filled with stress. Sanral came up to stand beside Elixia, and the two looked out at the constantly shifting room.
It's an illusionary maze. You all realize, of course, that we might be here for a while,
he said grimly. Elixia gave the mage a discouraged look and Sanral patted her hand in response. At their side, Meeks was examining the strange maze with a twinkle in her eyes.
I'll go first if you guys don't mind,
she opted happily and started forward. At that moment, Massage's hands grasped her shoulders and roughly pulled her back.
I don't think so, love. For one thing, we don't know what could be lurking in there. It would be rather sad to lose a fighter at this point in our quest. And not to mention painful for some of us,
he said with a hint of kindness in his usually cold voice.
Wait a minute, friends.
Will gasped from beside Nightshade and Prisma. He was fumbling about his robes for something. The team looked at him for a moment, and then Prisma got bored.
What are you looking for?
She asked the cleric dully. Will pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his robes. The edges of the thing were burned off.
It's from way back when we had just started our adventure. You all remember the secret passage that Nightshade had found right after we had freed that little chained halfling? Well, I found a map there and kept it. Maybe it's what we're looking for,
he said optimistically, his dreary mood receding now that he had made himself useful. Massage was not impressed.
A map?
He asked incredulously, raising an eyebrow at Will.
Will, the walls shift constantly,
he added. The team's cleric shook his head at the lithe drow.
Oh, for God's sake, wizard. Think a little, perhaps there's a pattern to follow,
he retorted smugly, proud of himself for having thwarted Massage's intellect. Beside Massage, Meeks felt the mage's muscles tighten. She giggled. Massage was so cute when he was mad. Nonchalantly, Will smiled at Massage and took a look at his map.
There's no indication as to what this map pertains to, but I'm sure it's worth a try,
he said and showed the paper to his teammates. The map was a blur of barely distinguishable directions and the party seemed doubtful. There was no sense running into something like the illusionary maze and getting trapped there like a bunch of fools. It was silent as the crew examined the map and then Massage, still frustrated, objected once more.
Oh please. It's crazy to think that this is the right map. Do you think Dran Dragor keeps an illusionary maze around here all the time?
He cried impatiently.
Of course not. The only reason why it's here is because we're here. It's common sense,
he argued, glaring at Will. Will's bottom lip quivered and he fumbled to find a response to Massage's stinging words.
Well,
he trailed off, gesturing with his hand uselessly.
I suppose you're right,
he breathed almost inaudibly, lowering his gaze.
Ha!
Massage cried, smiling proudly at the crew. They didn't smile back. Massage understood what he had done. He had ruined the team's hope for an easy way out, and all that in an effort to show his worth. The wizard's smile faded and he hung his head.
Sorry,
he said meekly and looked over at Meeks. The warrior was smiling.
You're smart.
She whispered to him, even though the whole team heard it. Massage exhaled loudly.
I'm sure he meant well, people.
Sanral said from beside Elixia.
He may have saved us from making a pretty stupid move.
He smirked at his fellow mage and, to the side, Will rolled his eyes. They all stared at the illusionary maze for a while before daring to speak again.
I really think we should get in there now.
Nightshade urged, her voice still tense. She kept looking back at the hallway they had emerged from.
Like, now.
She restated. The words took their effect and the team ventured forward cautiously. Before them, the walls moved from side to side and disappeared at intervals.
What if one of them hits us?
Sanral asked, eyeing the shifting structures suspiciously. He sidestepped into Meeks, who had decided to go the opposite way as he. Prisma jumped up at his side.
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it hurt, though.
She said with an audible gulp. The more the team moved forward, the more they came to realize that the room was enormous, and that the walls did indeed follow a pattern, making the group's passage a little easier. Will's voice sounded far off when he spoke, for a wall had appeared directly between him and the rest of the team.
I told you there would be a pattern.
He cheered. The wall that blocked him disappeared and he could join the team again. Massage muttered something.
This isn't too bad. We can do this.
Elixia called happily, dragging Sanral by the hand along with her. And then, the inevitable happened. 3 figures appeared along with the walls.
I knew we wouldn't be alone.
Massage whined, trying to pick a spot where the walls never appeared or moved to, a place where he could fight without worrying about the maze's incessant shifting. The rest of the team looked for a similar spot, all except Will, Meeks, and Elixia, who continued to move around. As the figures came into view, approaching stealthily and swiftly, they could be identified as mages, all 3 of them. Will, Elixia and Meeks tried to keep a safe enough distance from them to then ambush them when the opportunity came. The mages separated and went to the left, right, and center, so did the team's mages. Prisma blinked when a green-robed wizard came right for her and shot a fireball at her. The Drowess yelped and jumped to the side, giving away her safe position and putting herself in jeopardy amongst the shifting walls.
Innuend, Fias.
She yelled back at the mage who came after her. She launched a fireball of her own. The wizard snapped his fingers and disappeared, to then reappear directly in front of Prisma. The woman's eyes widened and she gasped, drawing her sword out from its scabbard in fumbling haste. The wizard drew a slender dagger from his robes and jumped Prisma. The 2 hit the floor in a heap, and Prisma thought it odd that a wizard would so deliberately engage in physical combat. Coming up slowly behind the 2, was Will, struggling with the shifting walls. The wizard launched a volley of magical missiles at Sanral. The drow snapped his hands out and created a wall of force. The magical missiles dissipated into the wall and gave Sanral a small amount of time to counteract the other mage's spell. He waved his hands in an intricate pattern and focused his attention on his red-robed opponent. When he would cast his spell, his wall would disappear and he would be once again exposed. Unfortunately for Sanral, his opponent was no fool. He knew what spell the drow was preparing. He spat sharp words and pointed at Sanral's magical wall, a disintegrate spell. The wall crumbled to dust and Sanral fought to keep his attention on the mage. Why did he pick such a long spell? The other wizard was coming on extremely fast. The third of Darkmoon's wizards was not so lucky. When he headed for the center, where Massage waited, he was greeted by 2 extra opponents. He hurried to cast an ice storm spell that would affect all 3 of his nemesis, but the others were quicker. Meeks and Nightshade appeared from behind a shifting wall and tackled the wizard to the ground, disrupting his incantation. Sword and halberd bit into the mage's flesh. Massage clapped proudly as the mage's lifeless body slumped to the ground. Prisma grabbed a handful of her opponent's green robes and pulled him off of her, grunting with the effort. She drew up her sword and plunged it down, hoping for a quick kill. The other mage's dagger came up and blocked the swipe, deflecting Prisma's sword out wide. The deflection gave the other mage a chance to get to his feet, which he did. But not for long. Prisma curled herself up into a ball and held up her sword in defense as she waited for the mage to cast another spell at her, but instead, she heard a gurgling sound and the mage collapsed atop her.
Ugh!
She groaned as she pushed the body off of her and looked up to see Will's smiling visage.
You're most welcome, Prisma.
Will said evenly.
Elixia!
Sanral cried, catching a fleeting glimpse of the warrior's flaming hair somewhere amongst the nearest shifting wall. His spell was coming to an end. The other wizard turned, in a slip of mind, just as Elixia appeared behind him. Sanral thanked the gods for having given him this chance. He completed his spell and directed its energy towards his inattentive opponent. The mage noticed his mistake too late and began to suffer his rather dramatic death. Elixia and Sanral both watched, one in awe and the other in pride, as the mage's flesh burned from his bones and crumbled to the ground along with the bones themselves a short time after. Alexia stalked over to Sanral and hugged him tightly.
Effective, but too much show,
she commented and nuzzled the mage's ear. The team gathered amongst the predictable walls and made sure everyone was all right. They forced themselves to hurry along the maze, hoping that no other impediments would come up and they would finally find a safe place to rest for the night. The mages needed to study and the warriors wanted their rest. When the group reached the other end of the enormous illusionary maze, the whole thing disappeared at their backs.
It's all gone.
Meeks cried almost disappointedly, noticing that even the three mages' bodies were gone. The group looked back from where they had come and beheld the large empty room that now loomed there.
Oh. Now that's frustrating.
Will gasped. He turned, as did the rest of the group, and faced a staircase going up.
Notice we run into a lot of staircases,
Alexia commented, a bit annoyed at the thought. No one bothered to answer and the group ascended the carpeted stairs. At the top was another mage, but Alexia and Meeks disposed of him rather quickly. Beyond, there was another series of 10 clerical chambers. The team knew better not to strut through the hall again.
We can't just return downstairs, we've done all we can down there,
Alexia stated quietly, seeing the problem. Meeks frowned.
But if we walk through there, they'll jump us like last time.
She whined back.
How about we fight them one way or the other?
Nightshade said finally. The group looked back at her in curiosity.
Well, if we have to fight them, then why not sooner than later?
She said matter-of-factly. The group, with difficulty, accepted the thief's logic and Will cleared his throat to call attention.
Let's just go. Pick a room and just go,
he said apocalyptically. Every team member drifted off to a room and knocked on the door, except Meeks who just barged in. There were no answers.
There's no one in here,
Meeks declared, coming out of the empty bedchamber. The others opened the doors and stood ready for a surprise attack, but no such thing occurred.
Maybe they're guest chambers,
Sanral suggested, somewhat perplexed. Prisma came up beside him and yawned.
That's just as well. I'm tired and I want some rest. If we keep the doors shut, I think we'll be all right for the night,
she declared to everyone. The group agreed and picked chambers.
I don't feel right sleeping up here. I'm so paranoid that clerics will come and deliver us to Dran and Sindel,
Alexia said quietly to Sanral as the two stepped into the chamber just across from Nightshade's. Sanral closed the door behind them and faced Alexia.
We'll be fine,
he said with a reassuring smile. Alexia looked around the quaint little room.
Privacy, at last,
she said triumphantly and looked up at Sanral. She rested a hand on the mage's slender chest and drew closer to him.
Did you really want to sleep?
She asked him with a childish pout. Sanral's pupils dilated and his heart raced.
And not if you didn't intend on doing so,
he said stiffly. Alexia smiled and took Sanral's spellbook from his slender hands to then deposit it on a small chair off to the side.
Good,
she cooed. To the entire team, sleeping or not, came a telepathic message. An innocent, familiar female voice pleaded loud and clear in the group's mind.
You've all come back,
she gasped.
I am being held prisoner and I need your help. Follow my directions and you will find me,
the message said. Will, awake with a guilty conscience, recognized the voice all too clearly.
Izzy,
he cried. Something had to be done. End of chapter. Chapter 19. Chapter 19 Child's Play.
I think we all heard it,
Massage said calmly. His nervous glancing got worse after the telepathic incident concerning Izzy. Beside him, Meeks grasped the mage's slender hand and nodded at her team.
It woke me up. And it was Izzy, all right. I could never forget that little voice of hers,
she commented thoughtfully, omitting the word annoying for Will's sake. The team had gathered outside their borrowed chambers and now stood in the hallway, conversing as quietly as possible about the previous night's odd occurrence. Nightshade and Prisma's expressions were rock solid and unbelievably uninviting.
I say it's a trap,
Nightshade said shortly. Prisma clutched the thief's thick cloak as she stepped up to stand beside her.
She's right. I don't want us doing anything stupid at this point in our mission. Izzy, if that was indeed Izzy, is hopeless, and not to mention useless,
the Drowess said, adding in her 2 cents in an effort to discourage the team from setting up a rescue mission for Izzy. The two friends had a point, but morality did not let loose its clenching grip on the rest of the team. Will was first and foremost in the Save Izzy campaign.
That's an atrocious thing to say, you two. Izzy is here and alive, obviously, and I can feel her presence here. If there's a way to take her home with us, then it has to be done,
he cried, letting his voice grow passionate at the subject.
Okay, say we save Izzy. What if we walk into our deaths by going off and facing Dran? What if she dies with us? Wouldn't it be our fault then?
Sanral proposed, playing on the cleric's feelings. He wasn't sure going after Izzy was such a good idea. Dran was too playful when it came to mind games. Since the morning, Sanral and Elixia had not let go of one another. They held hands and clutched each other constantly. Even though the couple thought they had indeed shared a moment of privacy, the entire team knew what had happened the night before. Will shook his head violently and made chopping gestures with his hands.
No. Would it be any smarter of us to just leave her wherever she is to die? I'd rather her fight with us than decay in some dank dungeon.
He rambled on. The team begun to get the idea that they would be Izzy chasing by the end of the day. They considered mutiny against Will, but that was very stupid and unthinkable.
Since when can Izzy use telepathy?
Elixia asked rather smartly. The little thief had never done it before. Will was quick to answer, making the valid question sound like something an idiot might ask.
It's probably a talent she developed but didn't find the proper time to use.
He explained hastily. Nightshade and Prisma were still not pleased, and their stubbornness grew with every moment.
I still say it's a trap. A great, big trap that we're all running head-on into.
Nightshade exclaimed and folded her arms over her chest. Prisma ground her teeth at Will when the cleric made a face at Nightshade.
Why won't you listen to your brain for once instead of your heart? Don't you see the mistake we're all making?
She cried, her voice cracking with strain and desperation. She gave every member of the team a pleading look and received a bunch of blank stares in return.
Damn you!
She fumed, her small fists clenching at her side and around Nightshade's cloak. The team grew silent for quite some time as everyone thought the same impossible thing. Why not split up? The option was a no-no. The team needed a cleric for healing and nourishment and a thief for tricky situations. Those two couldn't be split up fairly. And anyway, weren't they all working to reach the same goal? So saving Izzy was a sidetrack. Who cares? If it kept the team together until they reached the end of their mission, that was all that mattered, and everyone knew that very well. The crew looked at each other and realized that they didn't want to be split up. Not at all. They were a team and they would remain one until death do them part. They had grown to appreciate each other since the beginning of their mission and they didn't care to lose another of their small number for something as stupid as a disagreement. They would do what they would have to, whatever the consequences, for they were one now.
Let's go get the little wench.
Nightshade and Prisma sighed simultaneously, bringing a big smile onto Will's lips and causing the rest of the team to get ready for one of the final legs of their mission. Rain paced around the hypnotized Izzy and watched through the girl's mind as her old crew fought about taking the bait. He scolded himself for not having chosen Prisma or Nightshade as his targets for mind manipulation. He stood impressed at the two's persuasively pragmatic arguments. If the team decided to forget about the orange-haired girl that was now in his power, Rain would have the girl perform another telepathic message that would surely bring guilt to at least one of the teammates' minds. Suddenly, the two persuasive women gave out and the team shifted into gear. Rain wiggled his forefingers with glee and sent another psychic suggestion to the orange-haired thief who sat immobile in front of him. It was time to start reeling it in.
Follow the hallway and turn to your right.
Izzy's voice piped happily in the team's mind. The team stalked forward, feeling as though they were playing some sort of childish game.
How do you know where to go?
Elixia asked Izzy out loud. She had a sick feeling that Izzy could watch them from wherever she was being held captive. The little thief's perky voice answered Elixia's question in the entire team's minds.
I saw where they took me when they brought me to this place.
She responded.
The clerics weren't very nice to me.
She added seconds after. The words "oh shut up" came in a hushed whisper from somewhere in the back of the team. The group ended the hallway and turned to their right. There was a set of interjoining rooms just beyond and another turn immediately after that.
Where now?
Meeks asked, enjoying the little hunt like a child might a game of hide-and-seek.
Keep walking past two of the side chambers and enter the third one to your left.
Izzy's voice instructed curtly. Cautiously, the group walked past the two side chambers and turned into the third one to the left. The room was small, and there was a door off to the far left corner. When the team stepped inside the chamber, the exit behind them became magically blocked off by a clear force field.
Arg!
Meeks and Elixia both yelped, drawing their weapons and turning away from the wall to face a bunch of red-skinned creatures that resembled large worms with humanoid torsos. The creatures had just appeared out of nowhere and now there was about 10 of them all together, armed with spears and hissing annoyingly.
Izzy!
Elixia called out loud but received no answer. She raised her sword and prepared to fight the ugly creatures that moved in around the crew.
They're salamanders!
Prisma declared with a shout as one of them poked its spear at her.
Hit them with anything but fire. They're from the elemental plane of fire, it won't affect them.
She drew her sword and backhanded its blade across one of the salamander's chests. It screeched a screech resembling that of the mantises. The 10 salamanders gathered around the crew and picked their targets, then they began to slash with the spiny tip of their spears. Fortunately for the team, the beings were not very quick, many of them were dispatched with spells such as lightning bolt and cone of cold, and the others were simply outsmarted by the team fighters' quick maneuvers. Like the mantises from the test of faith, the salamanders' corpses dissipated into nothingness. As far as wounds went, the team suffered few. Prisma's arm was slashed and quickly bandaged, Will's hip was cut but not deeply enough to call it serious, and Sanral's hand was bruised after a run-in with the salamander's face.
What was that?
Meeks asked, watching the salamanders disappear around her. No one answered the warrior's question.
No, now that wasn't sent to destroy us.
Massage spat sarcastically, wiping blood off his dirty spell book. He sighed impatiently and, realizing it would be stained forever, smeared the blood on the cover in a symbol of exasperation. Meeks saw the mage whining again and patted his backside lightly.
Quit your whinin', Massage. I'm a mess too.
She said soothingly and pointed to her blood-stained clothes and chainmail. Massage looked down at her and wondered how it was that she could be happy living such a simple life. It was because she was a simple person, he told himself, and bent to kiss her lips quickly.
Go through the door at the back.
Came Izzy's voice again, as though nothing had happened. Elixia, who had decided to do the communicating with the trapped thief, spoke up loud and clear.
We were just attacked by a ton of salamanders, Izzy.
She declared in a not-so-happy tone. Izzy said nothing for a moment, then she gasped.
I didn't know. There was awful contortion in the telepathy link and I lost you guys for a moment.
She explained. Elixia looked over at everyone and they mainly shrugged, all except Nightshade and Prisma.
She's setting us up.
Nightshade said darkly. Prisma wiped the blood from her blade.
What help would she have been anyway?
The Drowess grumbled. Izzy's voice pretended not to hear. The team began to feel a little uncomfortable.
Hey.
Will called from the other end of the room. The cleric was pointing at the exit.
The magical barrier is gone. Maybe that's what was killing Izzy's link.
He opted and came over to the others of his gang. The group looked and considered the idea. Nothing was certain anymore. Without further dialogue, the group opened the door at the back of the room and stepped in, closing the thing behind them. They stood before a long, spiraling staircase.
Another staircase.
Elixia groaned, figuring the clerics of Darkmoon must get great exercise around the building. They ascended the stairs despite Elixia's protesting legs and Izzy's voice met them at the top.
You're almost there.
She cheered.
Go straight and you'll arrive inside this really big room. Instead of going in it though, turn left and go straight. You'll see a great big gold door with odd symbols on it.
Her high voice wavered.
That's where I am.
She finished and her voice took its leave. The crew did exactly what they were told and headed down the hall towards a golden-hued door that shone like there was no tomorrow. Their pace slowed to a cautious step, and they observed all the gorgeous tapestry and things that hung on the walls. Inside a small niche off to the left side, Nightshade's eyes fell on a red gemstone statue of a dragon.
Who am I? It's so pretty.
She cooed, her dark eyes going round. He reached out to touch it but Will's hand shot back and held her where she was.
Stealing is not a good thing, Nightshade, especially stealing from a temple. No matter how awful the ruler of the building is.
He scolded the older woman. Nightshade glared at him for a moment and then returned her eyes to the statuette.
I bet that thing is worth a lot in a market.
She went on, dying to touch the emerald eyes that shone beautifully. Will shook his head.
Thank you very much, Miss Elizabeth.
Rain's watery voice said shortly in Izzy's mind. The little thief jerked out of her hypnosis with start. She remembered nothing since she had fought with Rain.
What's happening?
She asked drowsily. In the corner of her eye, she could see the Illithids busying about the room. They seemed hastier than before and she wondered what was going on.
The time of our battle for Darkmoon is at hand, Elizabeth, and you have served us well.
Rain continued calmly, stepping behind the trapped thief's chair.
But of course, you realize, we do not need more enemies. So, I am forced to make sure that you don't act up.
He finished. Izzy wasn't sure she understood, but, she began but her words became screams as Rain sent an excruciatingly painful psychic blast her way.
This is a trap, 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 trap.
Nightshade sang to herself as the crew gathered before the golden door. Odd, carved symbols covered its surface, not a sound could be heard from inside. Massage and Sanral both leaned forward and examined the carvings, trying to decipher the language and meaning. Elixia and Meeks poised their weapons nervously.
What are they doing?
Elixia asked impatiently, desperate to get Izzy and run away from the creepy spires of Darkmoon. Meeks shrugged noncommittally.
Reading, but they seem to be having some trouble.
She giggled at the thought of a mage who couldn't read and Massage looked back at her and shot her an evil glare.
Oh my god!
Meeks declared after taking a quick glance at the gold door. The two wizards looked back and frowned. The little warrior stepped forward and planted herself between the mages.
No way.
She gasped and touched the door lightly. The team began to get worried and Will began to lose his confidence.
What is it?
The cleric asked. He didn't like seeing Meeks worried. That meant something really bad was going to happen. Elixia put her hand on Meeks' shoulder.
Well,
she urged her friend. Meeks whipped back to look at her team, her eyes watered and her lower lip quivered.
We're so dead.
She cried and immediately began to cry great big tears that fell to the plush carpet. Massage came to her side and hugged her tightly.
What are you talking about?
He asked, stroking her thick black hair soothingly. The little warrior sniffled against the mage's robes.
The writing. I know it. It's a lithid.
She cried and began to sob again, drenching poor Massage's shoulder. A gulp sounded over the team and Massage spoke once more.
What does the scripture say?
He asked softly. Meeks looked up at him and frowned.
The W what?
She asked dumbly. Massage held back a sigh and rephrased his question.
The writing, love, what does the writing say?
He watched as the water came to the fighter's eyes once more, but he held her gaze to stop her from bursting out again. Meeks swallowed thickly before responding.
It says that beyond that door is where the illithids are,
she said, and buried her face in Massage's chest. The team saw what was the problem with illithids. They were highly intelligent, highly powerful creatures. What they didn't see though, was why they bothered Meeks so much. The group figured it was because Meeks was weak-minded and would not be able to suppress any of the Mind Flayer's attacks. She would be utterly useless if she wasn't protected.
So? Does that mean Izzy's not in there?
Will asked guiltily, trying his best to ignore the looks he was getting from Prisma and Nightshade. Elixia gave Massage and Meeks a sympathetic glance.
If she's in there, she's well protected. Although I can't see why she would be,
she said, apprehensive now. Nightshade and Prisma's voices rang out in a singing tone.
Trap. Trap. Trap, 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 trap.
End of chapter. Chapter end.